Okay, let's get into it. It's 2026. The tariff war between Canada and the United States has been raging for over a year. Billions of dollars have been redirected, threatened, taxed, retaliated against. American consumers are paying more. Canadian workers have been laid off. Politicians on both sides are screaming. And everybody claims they're winning. But before we dive into it, if you are new here, subscribe, like, and share. But here's the thing nobody's actually asking. Who is winning? Like, really? With data, with receipts, with no propaganda from either side. That's what this video is. We're going to go sector by sector, stat by stat, and at the end, I'll give you a verdict. A real one. Let's go.
To understand who's winning, you need to know how the fight actually started. And no, this isn't just political theater. The economic stakes are genuinely enormous. February 1st, 2025, President Trump announces sweeping 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports and 10% on Canadian energy. The justification? Border security, fentanyl, illegal immigration. Canada's response? Fury. Within weeks, Canada fired back. First, $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs. Then, within 3 weeks, that number exploded to $155 billion worth of American goods. Orange juice, steel, household appliances. The shelves of every provincial liquor board cleared of American booze. Ontario's LCBO, one of the world's largest purchasers of alcohol, pulled every U.S. bottle. Then things got weirder. Steel and aluminum tariffs doubled, then doubled again to 50%. In August 2025, Trump raised tariffs to 35% on non-CUSMA goods, reportedly in retaliation for Canada's foreign policy decisions, specifically plans to recognize Palestinian statehood. Yes, trade war meets geopolitics. But here's the twist that nobody expected. In February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in. They ruled that Trump couldn't use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose these sweeping tariffs. It was unconstitutional overreach. The biggest tariff weapon in the arsenal struck down. Trump's response? He announced a new 10% global tariff under a different legal authority. CUSMA-compliant Canadian goods? Mostly exempt. Everything else? Still hit. Sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, automotive parts? Still very much in play. And now we've arrived here, May 2026. The USMCA, the deal that holds this whole continental economy together, is up for review by July 1st. One analyst firm puts the odds of renewal at just 10%. Think about that. Pause. Let that land. Okay, so that's the background. Now let's talk about who's actually bleeding and who's actually adapting.
Segment 2, the economic scoreboard. Canada. Let's start with Canada, because that's the underdog story here, the smaller economy, the one that supposedly had more to lose. Canada exports about 20% of its entire GDP to the United States. 20%. That's not a trade relationship, that's economic dependency. And when your biggest customer suddenly slaps a 25% tax on your stuff, you feel it. And they did feel it, hard. Economists estimate the tariff cycle from 2025 to 2026 has already reduced Canadian GDP by somewhere between 1.5 and 2%. That sounds small, but we're talking about billions of dollars wiped out of an economy that was already struggling with productivity. Canadian households absorbing an estimated $1,700 to $2,000 in additional annual costs. That's real money. Quebec's premier warned of up to 100,000 job losses in his province alone. Steel towns in Ontario felt 50% aluminum tariffs almost overnight. Motor vehicle manufacturing, which ties Canada and the U.S. together in one giant continental supply chain, started seizing up. By the end of 2025, Canada's exports to the U.S. were 16.7% lower than they were in December 2024. That's not a dip, that's a collapse in a specific trade lane. And the labor market? Youth unemployment surged, business investment softened. 3 in 10 manufacturing businesses said U.S. tariffs had a major negative impact. 1 in 5 said they plan to delay investments entirely. So Canada's losing, right? Case closed? Not so fast, because here's where it gets interesting. Canada didn't just take the hits. Canada adapted faster than almost anyone expected. First, trade diversification. Canada's merchandise exports to non-US economies rose 17% year-over-year in the 12 months to January 2026. 17%. While exports to the US were cratering, Canada was actively building new customer relationships: Europe, Asia, Latin America. Second, foreign investment. Get this, foreign direct investment into Canada totaled $96.8 billion in 2025, the highest annual inflow since 2007. The global investment community looked at a Canada being economically pressured by its giant neighbor and said, "We want in." U.S. investment into Canada specifically hit $52.5 billion, concentrated in manufacturing, trade, and transportation. Third, the Buy Canadian movement. This wasn't just government policy, it was a genuine cultural shift. Canadian tourism within Canada surged. Canadians returning from the U.S. shrank by 25% in 2025. The U.S. tourism industry estimates this alone could cost American businesses $4 billion annually. Canadians didn't just stop buying American products, they stopped visiting America. Fourth, and this is maybe the most surprising, Canada technically avoided recession, despite massive external pressure, despite the tariffs, despite the supply chain chaos. USMCA exemptions on compliant goods acted as a life raft, and domestic demand held up enough to keep the economy crawling forward. Canada's inflation actually came down to 1.8% as of February 2026, lower than the US. So when you look at Canada's scorecard, yes, there are real wounds, real job losses, real pain in specific sectors, but the economy didn't collapse, it pivoted, and that pivot has long-term implications.
Segment 3. The Economic Scoreboard, United States. Scoreboard, USA. Now, let's look at the United States, because the Trump administration has been selling this tariff war as a massive win. We're protecting American jobs, we're bringing manufacturing home, we're reducing the trade deficit. Let's check the receipts. First, the trade deficit. The whole stated point of tariffs is to reduce the amount the U.S. imports versus exports to close the trade gap. Did it work? No. The U.S. trade deficit actually widened slightly in 2025 to negative $926 billion. That's worse, not better. U.S. trade deficit 2025 equals negative $926 billion, wider than 2024. Why? Because you can't tariff your way out of consumer demand. Americans still wanted stuff. So instead of buying from Canada and China, they bought from Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand. The supply chain just rerouted around the tariffs. Global trade, excluding the U.S., expanded 4.4% in 2025. The tariffs didn't stop trade, they just changed the zip code of who benefited. Container ships, Southeast Asian ports. Second, cost to American households and businesses. The Trump tariffs represent the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. The Tax Foundation estimates the average American household is paying $1,500 more per year because of these tariffs. U.S. household tariff cost equals $1,500 per year, largest tax hike since 1993. General Motors, a company that benefits enormously from North American integration, put $3 to $4 billion in tariff costs directly into their 2026 financial guidance as a risk factor. That's a car company telling its investors, hey, the government's trade policy is costing us billions. That's remarkable. GM 2026 tariff cost forecast equals $3 to $4 billion. Third, inflation. The Federal Reserve spent years trying to get inflation down. Tariffs are by definition inflationary. They raise prices. A 100% tariff on all Canadian imports, which Trump floated in January 2026, was estimated to push U.S. inflation up by 1.5 to 2 percentage points almost immediately. Energy prices would spike, auto prices would spike, because Canada supplies the U.S. with massive amounts of crude oil, natural gas, and auto parts, stuff Americans need every single day. Fourth, the jobs argument. The whole pitch is that tariffs bring manufacturing jobs back to America. But a 2024 Harvard study looking at the 2018-2019 tariff round found that import tariffs had, and I'm quoting here, neither a sizable nor significant effect on U.S. employment in regions with newly protected sectors, ZIP, and foreign retaliation that actually had clear negative employment impacts, especially in agriculture. Fifth, the Supreme Court body blow. When SCOTUS struck down EPA tariffs in February 2026, it didn't just limit Trump's legal tools, it created massive uncertainty.
Businesses that had been trying to plan around tariff structures suddenly had no idea what rules applied. Uncertainty is kryptonite for investment. Now, to be fair, there are places where the U.S. has seen some wins. Certain domestic steel and aluminum producers got a boost. Some manufacturing sectors reported increased domestic orders. Tax revenues from tariffs did increase federal income. And the administration would argue, correctly, that the U.S. economy as a whole is large enough to absorb these shocks better than Canada. U.S. GDP is 10 times Canada's in absolute size. The U.S. GDP didn't crater. The stock market, despite volatility, didn't collapse. Consumer spending remained resilient, even if it became more expensive. But here's the uncomfortable truth for the America's winning narrative. The pain has been real. It's been distributed unevenly across American households and businesses, and the strategic objectives, closing the trade deficit, bringing back manufacturing, stopping fentanyl, mostly haven't been achieved. The tariffs were a blunt instrument used against one of America's closest allies, and the costs are now showing up in grocery bills, car prices, and investment plans.
Here's the thing most people aren't paying attention to, and it might be the most important variable in this entire story. USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA that Trump himself negotiated in his first term, is up for mandatory review by July 1, 2026, and the review has already turned adversarial. The U.S. wants Canada to close off a so-called backdoor. It doesn't want China using Canada or Mexico as a transshipment route to avoid American tariffs. This is now a major sticking point, especially because Canada recently struck a limited tariff truce with Beijing. From Washington's perspective, Canada is playing both sides. Canada, meanwhile, is digging in. The provinces have banned American alcohol. The federal government has buy Canadian procurement policies. Mark Carney's government is talking about building economic resilience away from American dependency, even as the U.S. remains Canada's irreplaceable largest customer. Investment bank Jefferies put the odds of a full USMCA renewal at just 10%. 10%. They see a 75% chance the agreement slides into a decade of annual reviews, a limbo that kills business confidence and investment, and a 15% chance of full withdrawal. Let me put that in plain terms. There is a non-trivial chance that North America's $700 billion a year trade framework falls apart within the next few years. That would be economically catastrophic for both countries, but, and this is crucial, it would be more catastrophic for Canada than for the U.S., simply because Canada is more exposed. And yet, here's the paradox. The U.S. genuinely needs Canada. Brookings Institution laid this out clearly. In sectors tied to national security, energy, defense, critical minerals, the United States has a structural interest in keeping Canada close. Canada supplies oil, natural gas, uranium, lithium, and agricultural products that the U.S. economy cannot easily replace. Canada supplies U.S. with crude oil, natural gas, uranium, critical minerals, lumber, auto parts. Trump can say Canada is a problem, but American refineries, auto plants, and defense contractors will tell you a very different story. The integration is so deep that even decoupling would be extraordinarily painful for the American economy, not just Canada's.
Small businesses, border towns, farmers. Look, it's easy to talk about GDP percentages and trade deficits and feel like this is all abstract. It's not. There are real people on both sides of this border who are getting squeezed. The mayor of Haines, Alaska, a town that's only accessible to the outside world through Yukon, Canada, went public, saying the tariffs were threatening the normally warm relationships between Americans and Canadians who depend on each other daily. In Ontario's steel towns, workers who had spent decades building cars destined for American driveways were staring at reduced shifts and uncertain futures. In Quebec, potentially 100,000 jobs at risk. On the American side, farmers who sold to Canada and suddenly faced retaliatory tariffs on their produce, home builders paying more for Canadian lumber, families paying more at the pump because Canadian oil costs more to import, a grandmother in Michigan paying more for her prescriptions because pharmaceutical supply chains run through Canada. This is what a trade war between neighbors actually looks like. It's not triumphant. It's not clean. It's two economies that spent 30 years integrating their supply chains, now trying to untangle them while simultaneously paying the bill for the mess. And the people paying most of that bill aren't politicians. They're workers, small business owners, and consumers. The Buy Canadian movement and the America First movement are mirror images of each other. Both feel righteous. Both have economic costs. Both are making a political statement at the expense of everyday people who just want affordable groceries and stable jobs.
All right, you came here for a verdict. I promised you one. Here it is. In the short term, the United States has the advantage. Bigger economy, more economic cushion, the ability to absorb shocks that would absolutely flatten a smaller nation. And frankly,
The tariffs did generate federal tax revenue, did put some pressure on Canada to negotiate, and did score political points domestically. But in the medium term, Canada is adapting faster and more effectively than most people expected. Foreign investment is surging, export diversification is accelerating, the Buy Canadian movement is reshaping domestic spending habits in ways that will outlast any particular tariff policy. And Canada avoided recession, which, given the scale of the economic assault it faced, is genuinely remarkable. And in the long term, both countries are losing, full stop. The U.S. trade deficit is wider than before the tariffs started. Manufacturing hasn't meaningfully returned. Household costs are up $1,500 a year. The strategic partnerships built over decades in defense, energy, critical minerals are fraying. And the USMCA, the cornerstone of North American economic integration, is genuinely at risk. Canada is being forced into a faster, more painful version of economic independence, which could ultimately make it more resilient, but at enormous short-term cost to workers and businesses that never asked for this fight. And the rest of the world? They're watching, and they're benefiting. Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan. They picked up the trade flows that got disrupted between two countries that used to be the world's greatest trading partners. The trade war didn't stop trade. It just changed the address. Here's my final thought. The scoreboard question, who's winning, might actually be the wrong question. A better question is, what was the goal? If the goal was to reduce the trade deficit, it failed. If the goal was to bring back manufacturing jobs, the data says it failed. If the goal was to strengthen North American supply chains and security, it has actively made things worse. The only real winner of the Canada-US tariff war is the narrative itself, the idea that economic conflict is strength. It's not. It's a cost, being paid right now by Canadians and Americans alike who never got a vote on whether the fight was worth it. Canada didn't win. America didn't win. Both countries are spending enormous political and economic capital fighting each other, while the rest of the world quietly increases its market share. That's the real answer to who's winning the Canada-US tariff war in 2026. Nobody. If this made you think, share it. Subscribe for more videos that go past the headlines.